public works and engineering and so forth, but this is a good core group to get started. All right, if we can jump to the next slide. How many, anybody on the call, you can use the little raise your hand feature if you want, have not been through this process before? Most of you have. All right, so apologize if some of this is pretty elementary, but we'll go through it quickly as there's only 23 slides. So let's just start off with why do we do this? Why have a hazard mitigation plan? And I guess the most important reason is that it both reduces losses, but it also eliminates the need to respond. A lot of times we think of physical losses to things, but can forget about the public works and the public safety costs of responding, which sometimes exceed the actual damages of the event. Generally, just to create resiliency and sustainability in the community by sharing data between different levels of government and academia, and basically continuously improving the risk assessment and the strategies. It supports decision making. For example, when you go in for capital improvement plan requests and so forth, having projects in the plan, that's adopted and publicly reviewed is helpful in those decision-making processes, and just in the decision-making processes of where to spend limited resources overall. And then this is a required update, Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, and the final rule after that created the regulations and guidance require that in order to be eligible for FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance grant programs, you have to have an approved plan that's updated every 5 years, and everybody involved needs to go through that update process every 5 years. If you go to the next slide. It's a bit on the hazard mitigation grants. Most of you are probably familiar with these, but just a quick recap. These particular grants are FEMA grants that require the plan. I do always caution people not to focus only on the FEMA grants during this process, even though they're the ones that drive it. There's a lot of other money out there right now, so just because projects may not fit into one of these grant programs does not mean that they should not be in the plan, because it's always helpful for those other programs. So the first one, BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. That program is the newest program out of FEMA. It's a few years old now. It replaced the pre-disaster mitigation grant. This is the one of the two on the list that does not require a disaster to happen first. This is pre-disaster funding. There's a lot of money available in it this year. We're in the midst of the grant cycle where MDEM has released a notice of funding availability, and applications will be due in shortly for this one, for the state to review and pass off to FEMA. This one has some focuses. It gives extra points for projects that address social vulnerability or benefit socially vulnerable portions of the community. It has a focus on community lifelines, and that can be a variety of things. It could be a major bridge in and out of an area, or it could be a supermarket or a shelter. It's things that are extremely important to have up and running during a disaster and after a disaster. It gives points and extra credit for green infrastructure projects. And it looks at things like your building code effectiveness grading schedule ratings and other things like that. So it kind of prioritizes this competitive pool of applicants based on a number of these factors. The two bits of good news is this one can be used for very large infrastructure projects, people, multiple $1 million projects, $50 million projects, etc. So there wasn't a lot of funding available for projects that size in the past, so this one is good for that. It also has a capability and capacity building component. So in the past, it was difficult to find money for like studies, permitting, design, those types of things. This will allow you to spend resources in phased projects and pay for those upfront things. it can fund mitigation planning. It can fund support for grant application and development. So it's a nice add-on, that capacity and capability building piece. The next program is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. That's a post-disaster program. So when there's a presidentially declared disaster declaration, typically about 15% of the overall damage number from the disaster is made available 6 or 8 months after the disaster to do hazard mitigation projects. So that one doesn't have quite as many of the strings as the BRIC program does, but it's only available after a disaster. They split out from that hazard mitigation grant program a post-fire component, probably for after wildfires, that deals specifically with wildfire projects. Probably not something that PG County will look at all that often, but it does exist. And then lastly is the flood mitigation program. That one is also not dependent on a disaster. It's an annual program, and it comes out at the same time as BRIC. And that one is focused on specific projects that prevent damages to buildings insured by the National Flood Insurance Program. So that one looks at repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss flooded properties. It looks at things like elevations and acquisitions, or small site improvement or culvert projects, or things where you can clearly demonstrate that you're avoiding damages to an NFIP insured structure. So a little bit more narrow focus. Next slide. So before I hand it over to Jade to take us through the first pieces of the update process, just a little stage setting for those who may not have participated in the past. A lot of times folks hire a consultant, particularly an engineering firm, to go off and do a project and bring back a deliverable at the end. FEMA's process for updating these plans is prescriptive, and as those of you who've been through it before know, it requires proof of participation by not only the public, but not only stakeholders, but all the jurisdictions involved, and you have to satisfy those requirements. So this truly is a team effort, even though we'll be doing the heavy lifting. Our role is to facilitate that process, provide the expertise and consultation, do all the writing and the technical work and the heavy lifting to update the 2017 plan. And the role of everybody on this call and whoever else we're able to add to this call is to please just participate, provide information that we request in a timely manner. We're in a screaming short deadline on this one, so we really have to make things move and all cooperate with data sharing. You all will make the final decisions, review the pieces of the plan as they're created, make sure that we're properly reflecting your community, and then provide local context and help us to do that. So if we all do our parts, it should go pretty smoothly. We can get this in on time and on budget, and have a great plan for FEMA to review.
All right, so I was just going to take you guys through an overview of the planning process, and specifically the update process and overall scope for this plans update. So as far as the planning process goes, we will be going through, the entire planning process as FEMA requires. We just won't be, doing major text updates, writing the plan from scratch, that thing. We're really going to hone in on the areas that have changed since the last update in 2017. So this will largely focus on making sure we coordinate with the right people, collect any new data, see if there's been any changes in capabilities, risks, and then see how those can be better reflected in an updated mitigation strategy, which will include providing updates on what has been done and hasn't been done with the 2017 mitigation strategy, as well as deciding, what actions and projects we want to carry over to the new plan, which ones, don't really mesh with our current priorities, and what new ones need to be included. And then just an overview of the public outreach strategy, because we will need to do this piece as well. We do realize that we have a short deadline here, but we want to make sure that we give the public and stakeholders adequate opportunity to get involved with the process. So we'll make sure we have an updated hazard mitigation website on the county's website. We'll have a online survey for the public where they can participate, as well as they'll also be invited to public workshops and meetings where they can ask questions, share their concerns and comments, and learn more about the planning process and the plan. And we'll also be trying to reach out to what we call like stakeholder or community champions. So basically any groups that have that kind of local impact, we want to see if they would like to get involved, because that's a great way to reach people in a meaningful way and get some feedback that we can really use. So it's not so much checking the box, but really making sure that this plan is as integrated into the community as possible. And we can also work on some other ways to engage the community, especially those that don't have time to come to public meetings, by exploring some opportunities to have a story map, making sure we post these public meetings and things online on YouTube, just so that it's easier for them to access as well. And just an overview of the project milestones. So we are at the kickoff meeting today. We'll really be focusing on collecting data, reaching out to the appropriate stakeholders, making sure we have everyone in the mitigation advisory committee that we would like to see here, at least getting out those invites. I'll also be reaching out with some information on how to update the capability assessment. So just seeing what's changed there. And then looking into the future, we will have a few workshops surrounding the risk assessment, the mitigation strategy, and the draft plan, where there'll be opportunities for discussion, for questions, and some back and forth as needed. And then we would finish out the project with the final review from MDEM and FEMA. So as far as the plan update requirements, getting into the specifics, so as you folks know, FEMA has released a new mitigation planning and policy guide that came out in April of this year. So it doesn't fully go into effect until I think it's April 23rd, sometime at the end of April next year. But I know a lot of communities, I think most of the ones I've talked to, have been raring to go with this, and they want to, get ahead of it and make sure they're in compliance during the updates that are going on right now. So overall, what the new guide says needs to be included in updates is pretty similar to the last one. As far as reflecting overall changes, it's just some of the specifics and that have changed, and a few additional requirements. So we go through, we'd update the risk assessment like normal, but we also want to pay special attention to social vulnerability, as Scott had mentioned, climate change, making sure that's adequately incorporated, and really looking towards future development. So taking into account any plans and changes that you guys are looking to make in the county. So this could be looking at your master comprehensive plan, I think Plan 2035. So making sure that that's adequately incorporated along with any data that can provide. And then along with that, we'd want to make sure that then we reflect those changes and any changes in priorities in the mitigation strategy. So this would, just be adequately explaining this through narrative form, as well as updating the actions that are in the strategy itself, as well as addressing how the plan has been integrated into other planning mechanisms throughout the county and the city of Laurel, and how that integration is planning to be done in the future. So one thing that the policy guide really emphasizes, the new policy guide emphasizes, is the right sizing of scope, what they call it. So they really want the communities that are updating their plans to choose the scope that is appropriate for them. So I included just some quotes here from the guide itself. But basically what it's saying is that, if nothing has significantly changed, then they wouldn't foresee you doing a giant, huge update of your plan, just for the sake of updating it. They want it to be more useful than that. So basically, basing your plan or the scope of the update on what has actually changed. So if not much has changed, then the update may be small than if, a ton of new hazard events have happened, you have all new hazard data and all of that, that would cause the scope to be a bit bigger. So because of our deadline and just the circumstances of the update, we are going to definitely take advantage of this right sizing of the scope, and we want to make sure we're just being as efficient as possible with the time that we do have, and just really focusing on updating the elements that have changed.
Yeah, and a good example is I'll lead into the first point and then hand it back to Jade, but we're going to be using hazardous loss estimation this time around. So we'll significantly improve the flood loss estimation piece of the plan, but probably will spend very little time on some of the hazards like sinkholes or other ones that haven't changed all that much.
Yeah, exactly. So this is just a brief overview of some of the improvements to the plan. FEMA does still like to see, continuous improvement from plan update to plan update. So as Scott mentioned, we will be using HAZUS. We'll be trying to expand the overall outreach effort to make sure we bring in more stakeholders. And that's especially poignant with the high hazard potential dam requirements that we're going to try and be hitting. So bringing in like dam owners and stakeholders surrounding dams is going to be very important in hitting those requirements. So that's just one area where we're going to be expanding outreach. As I mentioned before, addressing future conditions such as climate change and population changes, addressing social vulnerability, which, as Scott had mentioned earlier, will really help when applying for grants like BRIC and FMA, because they are looking for that now, including community lifelines, which will especially help with BRIC applications, and emphasizing building codes and land use and development ordinance changes and the importance of making sure that those are up to date. And then we know you guys are in the CRS program, so making sure we're adequately aligned with the NFIP, CRS, and risk map. And just utilizing the, some of the products that come out of risk map and making sure we're adhering to the elements as described in the CRS. And then, as I mentioned before, plan integration will make sure we're adequately integrating, both ways with Prince George's Plan 2035, with the state hazard mitigation plan, and with any other plans or reports from the city or county.
Right. The next couple of slides are more discussion oriented to get some feedback from you all. I'll start with a slide or two and then we'll go into some discussion. So the very first thing we'll be updating is the risk assessment. And for each hazard that's included in the plan, these are the categories of items that need to be updated. Each time there's a ranking. We'll look at that in a minute and get your feedback. A profile of the hazard to talk about what's changed since climate change impacts, which can change the profile. For example, we're getting a lot more high intensity, short duration rainfall events that are causing stormwater flooding than we did, 5 or more years ago. Hazard history, location and extent of occurrences, what's at risk, are there new developments that are at risk, are there things that were at risk that aren't no longer, the probability of future events based on climate change science and based on, extrapolating history into the future, potential impacts, and then integration with the state hazard mitigation plan, which means just looking at that and seeing what new things they've done there, what new data they've made available about hazards and how it can inform our plan. Next slide. So these are the hazards that were in the last plan and how they were ranked. The ranking is based on probability of occurrence, frequency, percentage of the community that's impacted. So for example, like lightning tends to impact a small portion of the community, but it happens a lot more frequently than some of these other ones. So things like that. These were all had weighted scorings and looked at all those factors and all there is to come up with a numerical ranking for each hazard. And then the committee bought off on that just anecdotally. So you can see the column in the column on the left is the hazards that are in the plan. The middle is how they were ranked last time, and then we just wanted to have a discussion about what's changed, if anything. There's no requirement to change it if it's still the same landscape. So we're curious if you think any of these should come out of the plan, any new ones should go in within reason, and if the rankings still seem to make sense the way they are. So I'd be happy to hear any input that people have.
I think it's almost kind of the same, but the ratio of flash flooding has been going up because of the climate change, and like the rainfall patterns is different right now. And yeah, I think that's the only thing that we need just to consider for this update.
Yep. Yeah, and that one was ranked high. It was ranked high last time, and obviously it will be again, but we can put more emphasis on it and talk about it in the context of climate change. And that's a tricky one because the coastal flooding and the riverine flooding are mapped. So we have that spatial data that we can do vulnerability assessment with. Unfortunately, the stormwater flooding from those events, or pluvial flooding as it's called, is not as easily mapped. But we did a lot with that in Frederick County and other places recently, and we'll probably make some of the same recommendations and do some of the same things here.
So,
anything? Go ahead, Doug.
I do have a question because I agree with Hassan about that flash flooding being an emerging a hazard for us, right? Is the mapping or being able to define those areas of flash flooding a requirement to make a hazard or to consider something a hazard, right? I don't know. If we know the general areas in which those types of floods are occurring somewhat often, is a mapping of those areas sufficient to include it as a hazard type in the plan?
Yeah, we can include it as a hazard type. One of the other things that we may do is put up what we call a story map. It would be a link in the survey where people can go to that and identify areas. Unfortunately, it's not mapped yet. FEMA's just barely starting to look at including that type of analysis with their flood mapping, but it won't be probably for another 5 to 10 years or more before that happens. So, like in Frederick, for example, they found some extra grant money to have us do a very high level, not a full-blown stormwater analysis, which would be really great to have, but just a very high level we call it rain on grid model to identify those areas generally, and we were able to use that for some analysis. That is not in the scope of this or the budget of this project, but I will probably recommend putting it in as one of the mitigation strategies to find some money to have somebody do that for you, because it's very valuable information to have. Right now, I think it would just be mostly anecdotal data or data that from what the city or the county and the city of Laurel knows and what people report to us. But we'll figure out some way to include it in there.
And second comment, the county recently completed a climate action plan in which extreme heat was identified as one of our emerging high hazards or risk for the county. So I don't know if that changes from medium to high. I don't know what we do with it because we
could consider changing that to medium high. So I'm just making notes and trying to talk at the same time. A lot of places are starting to include it in their plans, and FEMA's actually looking at adjusting their benefit cost guidance analysis guidance to account for projects that are related to extreme heat. So there's limitations on what can be done. So it's cooling centers are the popular one that everybody likes to talk about, but also shade tree plant. A lot of people are including shade tree plantings and things like that in areas where there's high reflexivity and urban heat island impacts. So there's a number of things we can look at. Potentially that should maybe be adjusted to medium high.
Don, I wanted to get your input on the severe storms, wind related, because I'm wondering how often are we seeing more and more power outages due to the severity of the storms that we're getting, which are, a side effect of climate change.
I can't, yeah, I don't, I know that we've had a couple this summer, probably last summer, where outages did occur or associated with those microbursts. So it's becoming a little bit more common. But I'm thinking that it's probably still in that medium to high ranking, because we do see it a little bit more frequently, but that frequency, I don't believe, has increased to the point where it would be high, right? I don't think.
Okay.
The other thing I meant to point out and I forgot is these rankings are kind of tailored to be like the level of attention we'll give it in the plan. So they're not necessarily saying that wildfire is low risk, for example. It's just saying we're going to give it a lower level of attention in the plan because it's not as high a risk as the others. So it's all very relative. So how we address with mitigation strategies the medium highs versus the highs really doesn't make much difference. We can put projects in there regardless of the ranking. Any other thoughts on this before we move on? It seems like the conclusions were heat maybe should go up a little bit. And then we should give more attention to the pluvial or high intensity rainfall events. Okay, duly noted. Next slide, please. So this one relates to the goal. So in the 2017 plan, there was basically one two-part goal, and that was increasing public awareness and mitigation of risks in general. So very simple. There's no need to really complicate it if we don't want to. What we've been doing in some other plans that has seemed to work well and FEMA's really liked is like, so we'll look at the Maryland State Plan. We'll look at your comprehensive plan 2035. Look at the newer FEMA mitigation policies and all those things. And we've been arranging the goals and objectives around the basic categories of projects in there. So you get those physical projects like infrastructure projects, elevations, acquisitions, culverts, all of those type of retrofit type projects. Then there's the capability and capacity building stuff, the public awareness piece, which the plan is heavy on now, and then forward-looking policy and planning related projects. So instead of just protecting against damages to things that are already in harm's way, looking at policy planning, regulations, things like that, and making recommendations around that. So we're sort of structuring our goals and objectives into these 4 buckets, and we just wanted to run that past you and see if you think it makes sense. If you think it does, we can craft something up for your review between now and the next meeting. Or if there's any comments on tweaking it or changing things, that's certainly, this is just a suggestion.
I think it's good because it's almost the same. Because we do have like physical projects, like we do all those 4 aspects, but the main aspects of hazard mitigation strategies, and I think as you mentioned, it should be the same.
Yeah, it's just a cleaner way of organizing it, I think.
Yep.
Okay. We'll take a crack at that and run something by you for review. Next slide. So changes to the mitigation strategies. Jade covered a little bit of this already, but one of the things that FEMA's been pushing back on in some of their reviews in the last 5 years is a lot of plans have things like, for example, continue enforcing the National Flood Insurance Program regulations. And the new argument is sort of like, okay, if you're already doing that as a matter of course, and you have been for a long time, that's more of a capability than an action. So it's trying to make the actions more measurable and actionable, and taking some of those other things, which are just like good things that you're doing, and moving them into the capabilities. There was a point, I've been doing these plans for a long time, and we used to try to get like everything we could dream up into the mitigation strategy just so we were covered. And the trend is sort of make it shorter, more meaningful, and really focused on what you think you're going to do in the next 5 years. So I just caveat or throw that out there to consider as we go through this thought process. At the next meeting, when we present the risk assessment, preliminary risk assessment findings, is when we're going to start brainstorming on projects to include in this update. But we will, between now and then, go through all the actions with you from the 2017 plan and see which ones are done, which ones don't make sense anymore, which ones should stay in for this update, and which ones should go into the capability assessment instead of the strategy. So we'll build one table around that, call it the disposition table for the previous strategies, and then we'll create a new table which will bring in all those carryovers and brainstorm new projects. And of course, some of the new projects will change to incorporate some of these changes in the grant programs, like the vulnerability and the community lifelines and all of that. And then we also have been integrating more actions from other related plans, Plan 2035, for example, just so there's consistency across those plans. If there's a good policy recommendation or something in that plan that in the context of hazard mitigation, we've been bringing them over so that they're captured in multiple places. So what we ask of you today is to just refamiliarize with the old plan and start thinking through things that are on your to-do list or your wish list for the next 5 years, so that at that meeting, when we get to that point, we won't be starting from scratch if people start thinking about it now. Right, next slide. So this is another discussion slide where we'll ask you some questions. I'll run through the questions and then we can start from the top. So we'd like to hear about what hazards have happened since the last plan, or what events, disasters, mitigation projects you've completed, current priorities, things you didn't like about the last plan that you'd like to see changed, what could make it better, and what actions in the plan could be, what can we do to make it easier to and more likely to implement projects. So I believe there'll be a questionnaire going out, or if it hasn't already, around some of these things so that you could do it, on your own, less on the spot. But we wanted to just, since we have a little bit of time remaining today, we're on slide 19 out of 23, and we've got 15 minutes to go. We're just hoping to open up this conversation and dialogue and hear from you about what's changed since we last did this together.
Changes in terms of what we have experienced, or changes in terms of the content of the plan?
Yeah, what you've experienced in terms of disasters or events, how it's been going with implementing the projects in the last plan. Any major changes in, like you mentioned, the climate adaptation plan, for example.
Yeah,
That's a major change.
yeah,
Things like that.
yeah. So, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about what's happening on the flooding side.
Mhm.
Of course, as I mentioned, we're, as a county, more challenged with these flash floods. With the availability of more federal funding to address infrastructure issues, over the last couple of years, the last 2 years or so, the county has been able to put more of our CIP efforts towards addressing these small residential drainage issues. So I guess our programming has changed a little bit or modified a little bit over the last couple of years to put more effort towards flood mitigation. But again, that's all based on the availability of grant funding. We also are beginning to embark more on efforts to reduce our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, right? And in many ways, there's some overlap with mitigation flood mitigation efforts on the natural resources side, green infrastructure, and that type of things. So I guess some of our county level priorities are moving in the direction of climate adaptation, but they're also incorporating kind of flood management type of priorities, if that makes sense. And I don't know if I'm leaving something out or.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I mean, climate adaptation is basically hazard mitigation. It's just hazard mitigation for things that are happening in the future as opposed to in the past. It's kind of the way I look at it.
Right. And I don't know. I guess Office of Homeland Security, you guys have been dealing with other major hazards, pandemic and the like. So
Yeah, so I kind of like piggyback on what Don mentioned. So we do also tried since last year to kind of encourage our communities to use more nature-based solutions based on the FEMA priorities, because they're encouraging to use nature-based solution or kind of combination of green and gray infrastructures to enhance the longevity of the mitigation strategies. And kind of like shifting through like the more innovative like mitigation actions. And for example, for the last year, we submitted a couple of BRIC and HMGP applications, try to implement the Community Lifeline Social Vulnerability Index, which is like the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, try to enhance the equity and also among like vulnerable populations, and kind of consider like unincorporated like areas within our county to enhance those mitigation projects. And I think based on also what Dan mentioned, the priorities would be more focused on like the shift with from, because we noticed that because of the climate change and the changes in rainfall patterns and more like frequent flash floods, it's going to be more towards like the risk or hazards that will be intensified or amplified by the climate change. And also, I think regarding like the 2017 plan, if we can update it based on what the current policy, like the current like updated policy has been issued from the FEMA, would be considered most of those aspects because it's emphasized on like the climate adaptation, like social vulnerability, and that would be the changes I want to see from this update in this update, because we eventually going to shift towards that way because of the climate change, and the risk of hazards will be much more due to the climate change.
We're definitely on the same page.
And with regard to your last question, how can we make going from actions in the plan to implementing projects easier, more likely? I think if we ensure that we're accounting for recommendations that are coming out of the other plans underway in the county. So, for example, we have a climate implementation task force that will be working together to identify those priority projects, efforts for the county to invest in over the next several years to reduce our carbon footprint. But we're also embarking on a few watershed studies with the Corps of Engineers and consultants, some of our county consultants, to identify mitigation measures within specific watersheds to reduce flood risk. So as those studies are completed, we should have some recommended projects that we can pursue as a next phase of the study to really get the projects in the ground and to eliminate or to reduce our residents' risk for flooding.
Do you have any idea on the timing of the watershed studies or the climate implementation task force results?
So the climate implementation task force should have recommendations by the end of this fiscal year, which would be in the end of June, early July 2023. Lalantha Tinicum is leading our watershed study, so we're working on the timeline for completion of those studies. Lalantha, can you remind me? I think we're looking at having a couple of studies complete early FY24, first quarter FY24, which would be between July and October of 2023. Is that right, Lalantha?
Yes, that's about right. We're looking out about 2 years for some of the bigger watersheds, but the smaller ones, maybe by 12 months from now, we might be able to wrap those up. So yeah, there are some that are a couple miles, couple square miles, but then there are also a few that are like 90 square miles. So those bigger ones will be a couple of years. So 2024 fiscal year, end of FY24. One more item that just popped into my mind was recently MDE alerted the county that we should be designating more of our dams as high hazard or significant dams. Based on the latest spreadsheet we have seen, there are 35 high hazard significant dams in the county, 18 of which are owned and maintained by the county. I think City of Laurel has one, and then a few others that are city municipal managed, and the remainder are either Parks and Planning, SHA, and I think there's one that's maintained by the feds. But anyways, the new tally is 35. I don't know how they play a role in the 2017 plan, but whether you had 35 there, but that's the new numbers. If you need those spreadsheets, how we came up with those, they're available on the MDE website too, but we can provide them.
Yeah, we definitely will need them. There's a new high hazard potential dam grant program. It's in its infancy, is just being developed currently. There's some extra requirements in the mitigation plan in order to be eligible for that specific bucket of money. I'm not remembering all of them off the top of my head, but the biggest one is that you have to have the owners of these high hazard dams involved in this planning process, or at least invited to be involved. So we definitely want to think about that in terms of whether or not we're going to be able to be eligible for that particular program this go around. So the other
just real quick,
yep.
real quick, I'm sorry, before I lose this, Dawn,
Yep.
when you can we communicate about the climate change community committee you were speaking on?
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, unfortunately, it sounds like both of those efforts, the watershed studies and the task force recommendations, are going to be a little late for this process. But if they come up with any interim findings, we could potentially get them in there, or at minimum, we can discuss those initiatives in the plan and how they'll be incorporated into it in the next go around or in between.
So I have a few things for the city of Laurel, but I don't want to cut off anybody from the county.
Please, we're happy to hear from you.
Sure. So we have made some pretty good strides in the community rating system. So we are actually officially a part of that now. So we've been putting a lot of efforts towards that. I'm gonna have to double check, but we may have done some flood proofing strategies to some of our city facilities. I'm not sure specifically what that is though.
Okay.
Soon we should have recommendations from the Army Corps on a Patuxent River regional project that we've been doing. So they should have a technical study out probably in the next month that gives some recommendations to some regional projects or individual projects for jurisdictions, stuff like that. Within that group too, the Corps did a Patuxent River flood study. So I have that as well. And absolutely correct. The city does have a dam. So we do have an EAP for the Van Dusen Road Dam. We also recently had this year inspections done for the dam. And then we also did our tabletop exercise. But then I think there may be a few that, because I'm just kind of picking this up. I wasn't involved in the last time between the city and the county when they put this plan together. So there may be some questions that I have either for this team or just for OEM. But I do know that there's something in here that talks about continued support for the region for drought response and planning. And I think it was supposed to happen with the county and also WSSC. So I'm not sure what that exactly is referring to, or if anything did take place. And then the other question I have to throw out is that from my understanding, and I do have it, but after this plan was approved by the county and the city went and did a flood addendum. That was submitted to the state and also to FEMA and was approved. So that piece was actually supposed to be it was submitted back to the county, which I think it was, but it was supposed to be I guess adopted by the county to put in this plan. So it might be something we want to take offline, but I'm not really sure where we stand on that or what that looks like, because there's more specific stuff. And honestly, because we're getting a late start on this, I haven't done anything with a flood addendum because I've been waiting to see really what's gonna happen with this plan, because I know it wasn't, adopted into the plan by the county.
Christina, if you could get that to us as soon as possible, that would be great. Because we can probably just incorporate it into this plan update and maybe not have to deal with it won't be an addendum anymore. We can just incorporate all the
Perfect.
pieces right
I'm
in here.
sure it needs some updating, but yeah, if we can incorporate it instead of being something separate, that would be wonderful.
Okay, cool. I thought we were going to end early and we're actually 2 minutes over. So let's move on and just wrap up with the next couple of slides. So I want to respect people's time, but I also want to make sure we cover everything.
Yeah, we only had a couple other slides left. This is just a visualization of the updated schedule that I sent in the past. I know we've said it a million times in this meeting, but we are under a short timeline. So it's very important for us to stay on top of the schedule as much as possible. And we just ask that you're as responsive as possible to any of our requests for information or context or scheduling meetings or any of that. We'd really appreciate it. And then the last slide we have here is just an overview of some action items. So I had already sent out a request for a contact list as well as a suggested stakeholders list. I know you guys are working on that as well as the data we requested, so we really appreciate that. A new request, I did want to ask if you guys have, so that flood addendum for sure, and then also if you have a final copy of the FEMA review tool from last time, or just any comments or recommendations that you got from the region last go around. We have some earlier stuff on our end, but it doesn't look like we have the final version. So we just wanted to make sure we incorporate all those recommendations as needed. And then the last two were just a heads up on some upcoming asks that we're going to have once we get started on the capability assessment and the mitigation strategy.
Yeah, and then Isan, when we were starting the call, you said you had some questions about the data request. So I don't know if we want to finish up and dismiss everybody else if you want to stay on the line and ask, and we can clarify those questions, or we can do it here with everybody. But for those who do have to drop off, thanks. Good conversation, and we'll definitely be following up with you.
Yeah, I do have a couple of questions regarding the data requests. So specifically for like critical facilities or infrastructures. So he requested for the shape files and addresses. The concern is these are sensitive data from our county. So like specifically for the critical infrastructures, concern is not going to go and share with the public, because some of those facilities, like federal facilities, and we can't actually release the address of those facilities. But I can provide you, for example, the list of like 16 category of critical infrastructures, and also subcategory of, for example, how many like critical infrastructures we do have and which components of critical infrastructures we do have. But if you're looking for like shape files, I talk with our GIS manager. If it's going to be public, we can provide you polygons. So the polygons doesn't have the addresses or like geocodes, but it shows that, okay, these are the critical infrastructures in some specific area. But I want to like clarify this one with you, and also if you need.
Hassan, Hassan, just a question with that request. Is the request for addresses of the locations, or is the request for information concerning inside the locations?
Sir, it's about critical facilities and addresses.
I'm fine with that. I'm fine, and I'll talk to James. You can go into Google and find the majority of these addresses. So if we need to sit down, and if it's anything that is of some sort of critical nature that can be shared, then we'll work through that. But to give an address and to give what the building is, critical infrastructures are all our police departments. We can give the address at all our firehouses, the health, the hospitals. So it's some that should be absolutely no worries about giving the addresses to. And some we may just have to vet it more cleanly and go from there.
Yeah, and certain things can be redacted or taken out, and that's fine. It's just so we can do the spatial analysis and say, you know, there's X number of critical facilities in this zone versus this one, and so yeah, however you want to work through that.
Okay, and the other question about like the population projections. So I think the last census update, we can get those information from the last census update. Was 2020, because again, I talked with our OIT, Office of Information Technology. We do not have those specific like geo-based like population projection, but it's available on the census website, so we can get it from those from the website, Census Bureau website. And also regarding the if you ask for the future development, what exactly looking for future development?
So if there's areas within the county or within the city of Laurel that have been identified as growth areas, or areas where you know that there's going to be large scale development. I know it's pretty urban county and it's pretty built out already, but if there are specific areas of the county where you're encouraging or anticipating growth, that type of thing.
Okay. Okay, that's all from me. If I do have more questions, I'll reach out to Jade. And yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you all very much. And Jade's email is on here. Feel free to, I think most of you know how to reach us, and feel free to reach out with any questions or comments or additional data, things you want to see in there, because we don't want to, just because we're rushing to the finish line here, we don't want to miss anything important. You also feel free to put things in front of us as we go. It doesn't have to wait for these meetings. Okay, thanks. Have a great week.
Thanks,
Have a great
everyone.
weekend.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.